Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to the last lecture in this cognitive psychology module. And today we'll speak about executive control. And I said this won't be part of the exam, mainly because we will cover topics which are not in the textbook, which is not entirely true. We actually skipped one little thing in the chapter on attention, and this was the last part about the Supervisory Attentional System, the SAS. And we will speak about this today. However, still, because I mentioned it's not relevant for the exam, that of course holds, even if it's in the textbook. Okay, so we'll speak about this after a brief introduction, having some theories of executive control, and then have some examples of typical tasks which are used in the context of executive control or executive functions. And then in the second part, we'll speak about the exam again, and it's basically the same thing we already spoke about in the lecture of language. So, but you again have the opportunity to ask questions. The recommended reading of this week is a paper by Donald Norman, and it's called Categorization of Action Slips, and it's rather entertaining to read. It fits into this idea of supervisory attentional system and like everyday mishaps which happen to us. How can you categorize them and how can they explained in this context? We will see that later in a bit more detail. Okay, let's start with an introduction into executive control. And as usual, we try to start with a definition, and the term executive control is rather unwell defined, let's say. So we can start with a definition which may look something like that, which says executive functions are mental processes for the management, and management means regulation and control of other cognitive processes, in particular in relation to complex actions. So in other words, what we are looking at are functions which are not directly involved in coordinating tasks, but are, let's say, hierarchically above the normal everyday task control processes and coordinate everything. We will see in a couple of examples in a moment which probably make that point a little bit clearer. There are a couple of synonyms which are often used interchangeably with executive control, which could be executive processes or executive functions or executive control processes. Some people use the term controlled attention pretty much in the same context as other people would use executive functions or executive control. The central executive system of the working memory model of Baddeley and Hitch is pretty closely linked to that, and as we will see later today, the supervisory attentional system as proposed by Norman and Shallice. Okay, let's have an example of what executive functions are really there for. Suppose we have a simple action. We want to peel potatoes. That's very straightforward and not very complicated. So we have a start state, unpeeled potatoes, and we want to have peeled potatoes. So what we do is we just peel them. So there's nothing really complex about that. Now suppose we want to prepare a potato gratin. That's a bit more complicated dish to do, and it may take longer time. So what have we do to do that? Just kind of schematically as example. First we have to peel our potatoes, and then we should cut them into slices. It would be a rather unwise strategy to first cut them into slices and then peel each individual slice. So there's a natural order here which is better than others. Then we may pre-boil the potatoes so that they don't take that long in the oven. That may take some time, and when they are pre-boiled, we may put them into the casserole dish. Because that takes some time, we may do something else in between. So we may switch to another task, and that we grate the cheese, which comes on the top of that in the end. And when we put the potatoes in the casserole, we put the cheese on top, and then we can put everything into the oven and wait until it's ready. Now it might be, sorry, that while we are grating the cheese, the potatoes are boiling over the water. So what we have to do is we have to stop here, take care of that, maybe reduce the heat, and then we can continue to grate the cheese. And this is a classical example where people would say, okay, you need executive control functions to coordinate that type of task. What are these functions in particular? So, first of all, it's sequencing, that we really do them in the right order. Second is monitoring. We are at one task, but we may monitor some other processes, whether the progress is good, whether it comes to errors and mistakes. We have a component of multitasking here, that in the sense that we have to switch between the two tasks. Speaking with respect to cognitive processes, what we may have to do is we have to inhibit the task of grating cheese to be able to switch over to take care of the boiling potatoes, and then switching back to the other task. So we have task switching, inhibition of tasks, things like that. To executive functions we also count processes such as planning. So a day before, okay, what shall I eat tomorrow night? I get guests. Okay, a potato gratin. Do I need to go shopping for that? Or do I have all ingredients at home? That's part of that. And feedback. So when you eat the gratin and then say, well, next time maybe a little bit less salt would be good to improve the taste. So these are rather prototypical sub-functions or subcomponents of executive functions, which are involved here. And it has been shown that, for instance, patients which suffer from specific lesions, in particular of the prefrontal cortex, that they suffer with these type of things. So there are cases, especially in cooking, for instance, described, where they say, well, people can do all individual steps. They still can cut potatoes into slices, they still can boil them. However, for instance, they can't put them into the right order. They do that weirdly. They have problems differentiating which ingredients may go into which sub-dish, or things like that. So these coordinative and planning functions seem to be something special. So a little bit to reiterate, the core executive functions or tasks are, for once, executive attention. So we select with our attention what we need to process to achieve our goals. It's a task switching, moving executive attention between the tasks. That may involve inhibition. That means we have to ignore irrelevant information to be able to focus on one thing. So for instance, if you want to focus on studying your exam and the TV is running in the background, then you may have to focus on that thing and have to inhibit the TV commentary in the background. The planning, what we said, the sequencing of activities, and the monitoring. Am I really on track? Am I about to make a mistake or an error? Okay, why are they called executive functions? And one reason is because they are pretty much like a chief executive officer in a company. So in a way, they manage the processing of the tasks without actually being involved in performing the task, like in a CEO. So when you have a factory which produces something, then you may say the CEO is really crucial so that the factory is up and running, that all supplies are ordered, that the distribution of the ready products is done, so that the production line is set up properly so that production can work. But the CEO is actually not really involved in producing the product. He's not there at the production line assembling it or something. That's done by other people. So in other words, they are separate processes which are independent of the basic cognitive processes. They coordinate them. So where does this concept of executive function originate from? And I mentioned that already. One of the early people who included executive or considered executive functions more explicitly was the working memory model of Baddeley and Hitch. And we spoke about that already in a bit of detail. We have these three substores: the phonological loop, the visual spatial sketchpad, and later added the episodic buffer. And then we have the central executive system, the CES. And in this working memory model, the CES basically controls and manages the contents of these individual subcomponents of working memory. So it's responsible for maintaining information, updating, monitoring, regulate the flow of information between the buffers, and things like that. So it was originally defined a little bit in the context of memory, and nowadays the concept is used very widely in cognitive psychology. So what you will find is that the exact definition, or what people do understand under the term of cognitive of executive function, depends on the background the people come from. So when you have researchers which come from the memory, or more specifically working memory area, then the term executive function often refers to things like managing storage, memory contents, things like that. If you have people who come more from the area of action control, then they often understand things which are related to the management of task processing, inhibiting a task, switching between tasks, things like that. Then you may have people who are more interested in the functional neuroanatomy of certain brain areas. Then you have people who look, for instance, okay, what's the prefrontal cortex doing? And then, I mentioned that briefly already, the area of neuropsychology, who are interested in specific syndromes. So for instance, if you have damage to the lateral prefrontal cortex, you often observe something which has originally termed, due to the anatomical location, the frontal lobe syndrome. However, nowadays it's called the dysexecutive syndrome, because people typically show a deficit in executive functions, while they can do all the basic tasks. And there is, in some sense, sometimes a rather limited exchange between research communities from these areas, so that they have a slightly different understanding of this term. So that's important to keep in mind if you speak to people. Okay, do you have any questions regarding this introduction? Okay, then let's go on with having a more closer look at theories which explain how this executive control might be implemented. And now we're speaking about the supervisory attentional system, which you actually can find in the Gobet textbook in the chapter on attention. It's in the last bit. And this was originally proposed by Donald Norman and Tim Shallice, and it's very widely used still today in the clinical context. So it's still a very valid model. So how does it work? And the idea how they propose their model is, how do we control actions? How do we manage everyday life, so to say? And one component then is the supervisory attentional system. And the smallest kind of component they talk about are schemas in their model. And schemas are learned sequences of thought and action. We will see an example in a moment. And like scripts, they basically specify behavior in certain situations, so that we are able to do tasks, basically. And they propose that schemas are organized hierarchical. So we may have very low-level schemas, for instance, very simple actions. So we may have a schema for peeling potatoes. And there are high-level schemas, which are more complex. It may be, for instance, preparing a complete potato gratin or complex dish, or they may go up to complex things like problem solving. In addition, they propose that there is a huge quantity of schemas. However, it's finite. It's not endless, infinite. And the basic idea is that we have all these schemas in a kind of a database. And schemas can be triggered by external stimuli, for instance. And when a certain schema is activated, receives activation, and this activation then exceeds a certain threshold, then it is executed. And you may know that from your everyday life experience. Sometimes, this explains, for instance, why sometimes things capture our attention and let us deviate from our plan. So a typical thing is you go into a room to fetch something, and you come out of the room with a completely different thing. Because you saw something and you thought, oh yeah, I wanted to take care of that anyway, and you only deal with that situation. And then you go back. So schemas can be activated, as I said, by external stimuli, by perception, by input. However, they can also be internally activated. So for instance, when a schema just has been performed, it may, as an output, activate the next schema to produce a proper sequences of actions. And with regards to functional neuroanatomy, the idea is that the schemas are potentially localized in more posterior brain areas. Let's have an example of such schemas. So it may be that you walk into your kitchen and you see dirty dishes. And if you live in a shared house, then you may know that this holds only for some people, that seeing dirty dishes is a trigger for actually the schema of cleaning dishes. Some people seem to be very immune to that idea. And this schema, clean dishes, like a hierarchically slightly higher level, may then be composed of several lower schemas. So for instance, put water into a sink, add washing up liquid, wash the dishes, first wash all dishes, then rinse the dishes with clean water, and finally dry them all with a towel. Once we have finished that schema clean dishes, which was triggered externally, this may give rise to an internal trigger of something like use hand lotion or cream or something. Okay, so this is a schematic illustration how Norman and Shallice proposed this all may look like. So we have perceptual input, and then we have what they call a trigger database. That's what I meant. So dirty dishes may be a trigger for clean dishes, which may be a rather large schema, which then has sub-schemas, which then run one after the other. And then when one schema is selected, we actually do everything which is associated with that. Okay, so far, the model basically would specify that we pretty much run an autopilot. An external stimulus could activate some schema, and we would just do that. So we would run around a little bit like a robot, seeing something and then doing that. And so there's not really enough yet to explain human behavior. So they proposed two mechanisms of actually controlling schemas, managing schemas, or the execution of schemas. And the first one is contention scheduling, and this is a rather lower level, simpler mechanism, which runs or is active or responsible mostly for familiar situations, which we have done a couple of times and which often have a similar structure. So it's right, sequencing schemas for typical sequences. So like getting ready for work or university in the morning. Probably most of you have a pretty standard routine they always follow every morning, and that routine is usually coordinated by contention scheduling. One mechanism in contention scheduling which is called lateral inhibition. And that means that when one schema is activated, it automatically inhibits related schemas. And that ensures that our plan is consistent. So for instance, going back to our example of cleaning up dishes, washing up dishes, what you may do, you have your first plate, you washed it. Now this may automatically trigger a couple of things. A lot of schemas may be activated now at the same time. You may rinse that one and directly dry it, or you may just leave it with soap and take the next plate, and then in the end rinse them all in one go. So contention scheduling makes sure that you follow one single plan. So when your idea is, I will first wash up everything and then rinse everything, then it makes sure that all the other schemas, which also are highly activated, don't interfere with your plan. Along the same lines, it prevents that you try to automatically engage into more than one action at the same time, so that you stay on your plan. Because it may easily be that when you have more than one external stimulus, that you have more than one schema which is activated beyond its threshold. So that's the management of schemas of a rather basic level, let's say. And then we have the supervisory attentional system, the SAS, which is in this hierarchy of control the highest level, the more complex level. And that's the one which is equated with executive control, basically. So it has the ability to manage everything. So it can activate schemas, it can override the decisions made by contention scheduling, for instance. And we need the SAS in particular in certain types of situations. And these are novel situations, because we don't have schemas for these situations. We have to create new ones. Here we need the SAS for that. When we have very complex planning and decision-making processes, then contention scheduling is beyond its merits, and we need the SAS. When we have strong habitual responses which we need to overcome, then we need the SAS. An example would be, in the morning, you probably, unless you live on campus, you go the same way every time to work or to university or something. And it may be that you say, oh, tomorrow morning, I have to pick up something from a friend or from a shop, so I have to take a different route. And you may know that from your experience that you're very likely to end up at university and say, oh my God, I forgot to go there. So you have a very strong habit of taking the usual route, and you run in kind of autopilot, and the SAS usually is there for you to say, no, this morning I don't do it like that, I do it differently. And quite often it works all right, but it shows that we actually need such a control to overcome these things. And we need it in critical situations, which are very difficult or maybe dangerous. So if you, for some reason, have to climb up a tree or a very high ladder or something, then you suddenly become very explicit and get conscious and aware of what you are doing, of every step and every move you make. And then you may be under full guidance and control of the supervisory attentional system. Further functions, which are running often generally alongside, is the monitoring of schema execution. As I already said, we typically constantly monitor whether everything works all right or whether we made a mistake. As I said, novel situations, so the creation of new schemas. And the idea with respect to the functional neuroanatomy is that the SAS basically is localized in lateral prefrontal brain areas. This is the diagram which illustrates how the SAS can control schemata. And this is basically like the diagram we have seen before, but a little bit more blown up, more complex. So again, we have our perceptual input, we have our trigger database, and the triggers may activate different schemas. and then one is selected here and is further followed up then basically. And again, let's say an example, you have two schemas here. Suppose you are sitting at home in the evening, and one schema is watch TV, the other schema is learn for an exam. And for a lot of people, the initial state would be watch TV has a higher activation than learning for an exam. However, because you're a good student, you really want to force yourself, no, I turn off the TV and I sit down and learn for the exam. So here, the SAS can take influence via these channels and basically can reweight the activation levels of the schemas, so that actually the schema of learning for the exam has the highest activation and is the one which is followed and executed. Okay, so going back to the anatomical localization of the SAS and the schemas, as you can see, this is a schematic illustration of the brain, and let's go quickly through the brain anatomy. You know that we have several sub-areas like vision in the back, hearing here, the temporal lobes, then somatosensory processing here, and then we have this central sulcus, which is a very prominent landmark divide in the brain. And anterior to the front of the central sulcus, we have movement control. So we have really neurons here which go directly down the spinal cord and control our muscles. And what happens here is that information is processed more and more abstractly. So in vision, you know that first we have very simple detection of just edges, and then we go more abstract to more complex forms until we end up with faces and everything. And then we have areas which already integrate this information, multimodal association areas, which are still posterior. So in a simplified way, you could say all the posterior part of the brain is mainly involved with perception, with processing the input we get from external world. There are superior parietal areas which are probably also strongly involved with the output, like with the control of actions. Then we have, from these multimodal association areas, fibers, neurons, which have really very long axons and project the information into the frontal cortex. Long association fibers, which are a couple of centimeters long. Here in the prefrontal cortex, or frontal cortex, then we have probably the location of executive functions and also the supervisory attentional system. So this area receives all the input about our external world, and in addition has access to our emotional states from the limbic system and from other subcortical areas about our body states. Are we hungry, thirsty? Are we tired? Things like that. So this brain area is perfectly suited to make decisions because it has all available information. And once it made a decision, it has a perfect means to implement them into behavior, because the lateral prefrontal cortex has a strong output via the premotor areas to the primary motor area to control behavior. Now the idea is that the schemas are located here in superior parietal areas and the SAS is located here. So when we actually have damage to the lateral prefrontal cortex, we get the dysexecutive syndrome. People can still peel potatoes, but they can't prepare a potato gratin. Okay, so that's what I just basically said. Yeah. Okay, so, but even without lesions in the brain, we often have situations that the SAS doesn't work perfectly. And we can see a couple of everyday errors which happen to us, which can be explained in this context and model of the SAS. So for instance, capture error, where the behavior is based on an external trigger and not the plan. What I mentioned before, you intended to do that, but were distracted, and then you follow that different plan. Another example is utilization behavior that is more prevalent in patients with prefrontal lesions. Utilization behavior is basically that people with prefrontal damage sometimes have that, that as soon as they see an object which can be used for some purpose, they do that. So if you place a piece of paper and a pen in front of them, they will just take it and start to write something. You really have to take it away from them to stop them doing that. We have problems, especially again in patients with perseveration. So like in the Wisconsin card sorting test, we will see that in a moment, this test, people get stuck with a certain rule. I will explain that in more detail when we speak about the test. We have impaired planning, which is used or investigated in the Tower of London task, for instance, with the 3 pegs where you have to move the discs. And we have distractibility. So people with SAS problems often have severe problems with the Stroop task, for instance, where you have to name the color of the ink of words. And there are a couple of papers and one book, actually, Human Error by James Reason, which are, for scientific papers, rather entertaining to read because they try to investigate and scrutinize, why do we make these errors? Can we classify them, categorize them? What may be the source of these errors? And this is the recommended reading for today's lecture, or the additional optional reading for today's lecture. Okay, to summarize these ideas on the SAS model. And as I already initially said, it's still a very popular model of executive functions or executive control, how it is implemented, in particular in the clinical domain, because it proved very good to explain things. One problem of the model is, we just said the SAS may reweight the activation of schemas to follow your intentions, your plans. But where does the SAS know what your plan is? So in a way, the SAS in itself cannot explain really human behavior because there's still something missing. It can't explain why it reweights and deweights TV and increases the weight of learning for an exam. So there has been posed the question whether the SAS basically is a homunculus. And in these types of models and theories, a homunculus is really the idea of that you have a little man inside your head which tells you what to do or which decides what to do. But then you have learned not very much, because you may ask, okay, where does this little man knows it from? Does he have a brain as well, and how does his brain work? So that's a general big problem in explaining human behavior, things like free will. Okay, do you have any questions regarding that model? Okay, then let's speak about a couple of executive tasks before we go into a break. Okay, we've seen already the Stroop task. If you remember, we have words where color words like green or red, where the ink of the word is incompatible with the semantic meaning of the word, like the word red in green color, and you have to say green in the task. So this is a very difficult task if you remember our practical demonstration. If it is incongruent, here you have to say blue, for instance. And with the fMRI, it has been shown that you actually can dissociate two components in this Stroop task, which is associated with a lot of people, with executive control. Because what you have to do here, when we go back to the SAS, your normal tendency would be to read the word green. That's your schema. With the words, you read them. However, you need the SAS to override this habitual behavior and to name actually the color. And MacDonald and Carter and others have done a very nice MRI study and shown that you can dissociate two subcomponents here. One is that we have to adjust our behavior, the implementation of the executive control, and that is mainly localized in the lateral prefrontal cortex, where we said there is executive control and the SAS localized. And then we have the detection of conflict. That means the first say, okay, something is going wrong here, or something is very difficult, or we have conflict here. We need executive control to manage this situation. And that is in a brain area which is in the midline of the brain, between the hemispheres, so to say, and this is a so-called anterior cingulate cortex. So you could say, here we detect problems and say, whoop, something's going on, and then this brain area starts to implement this control and to coordinate the processing of tasks. Another widely used task in the context of executive control is the so-called go, no-go task. And it's a very simple task with respect to the instructions, what you have to do, but actually doing it can be very tricky. So your task is respond, for instance, by pressing a key whenever you see a number, however, not when the number is 4. So you have a lot of go trials, but sometimes you have to not go and withhold your response. And that can be very challenging, in particular if you are put under time pressure. If you are made to respond as quickly as possible, otherwise you get a timeout error or something. A closely related task is the stop signal task. Basically the same, respond whenever you see a number, but not when you hear a tone. The advantage of that task is that you can present the stop signal actually after you have presented the stimulus. So you can test where is the point of no return for people, where they can't stop their response anymore. And what you need in this task, obviously, is a very good control of inhibition. You need to be able to inhibit quickly and strongly something which you already had to do. And you can manipulate that. For instance, if you have a lot of go trials and very occasionally only no-go trials, it becomes a very difficult task. Another task, which I briefly mentioned before, is the Wisconsin card sorting test. And what you have to do here, or the participant basically, is to figure out a rule how to sort cards. So this is the typical set you have here, and you have 3 rules. You can sort cards according to color, or to shape, or to the number of items on the card. Now you have these cards in front of you, and I give you now this card, and you have to sort it on one of the piles. The point is, I don't tell you the rule. You have to figure it out for yourself. All I do is, when you put it on a pile, whether you did it correctly or not. So you may first have the idea, okay, let's check the color rule, so you would put that card on that pile. And then I might say yes, and you say, okay, it's color rule, so I stick with that. However, if the rule is number, I would say wrong, and the card would have to go here, because it's 3 items and 3 items here. What happens now to people with prefrontal lesions, that they get stuck with the rule. They are fine to figure out the first rule, but then they are not able to inhibit this rule and be able to switch to a new rule. Because at some point, the experimenter switches the rule without telling you. He just suddenly starts to tell wrong all the time. So you know, okay, it must be a different rule now. For these examples, you need the SAS to say, okay, a new rule, the old rule strongly activated by performing it a couple of times has to be inhibited, and I have to search for new rules. So this is a traditional task to test for the dysexecutive syndrome. Then we have the task switching paradigm, which has first been described by Jersild in 1927, so it's quite an old paradigm. And Jersild still worked as usual at these times with list of numbers. So it's not a computerized task, obviously, at these times. And what participants had to do is they got a list of numbers, and they had to add 3 to each number. Like 15, okay, the response is 18, 15, 11, and so forth. And let's say he got a list with 30 numbers, stopwatch, took the time, how long does it take? Then a second list, subtract 3 from each number, 27, 75, so here it's 24, 72, and so forth. And then you may expect what comes up next, because it's task switching paradigm. He asked participants to alternate between adding 3 and subtracting 3. So this would be 21 again, adding 3, so 38, subtracting 3, 62, and so forth. And again, he took the time for that. What he found is that when you have to alternate, you are slower. So he said there are costs to switching between tasks. And these two costs are taken as an indication that you need executive control to manage that, to inhibit one task, activate the other task, inhibit, so you go back and forth. The task switching costs are basically the time you need for the mixed list divided by the average of these two times. This paradigm has been later on picked up again, and there's really loads of research in that area. And one widely acknowledged paper came from Rogers and Monsell in 1995. And they changed the paradigm slightly and used which is called an alternating runs paradigm. And participants saw on the screen always like these 4 quadrants, and always a stimulus like G7, which has 1 letter and 1 number. And they had 2 tasks. One task is the letter a consonant or a vowel? And the second task is the number odd or even? They had to respond with 2 fingers only, with a double mapping. So for instance, the index finger of one hand is either a consonant if you do that task, or an odd number if you do that task, and your middle finger may be the respective other task. And the numbers are then, or these items are shown successively in the quadrants. So the next one appears here, the next one here. And people are instructed to do the letter tasks if it appears up here, and do the number task if it appears down here. So from here to here you have a task switch, here you have a task repetition, because you do twice the number task, then you go up, task switch again, then task repetition, and so forth. And this way they measured task switching cost by this paradigm, and observed as well that you have profound task switching costs. There are a couple of explanations for these task switching costs. For instance, which is called task set inertia, the idea that the old task set just lingers on, and you need inhibition to just really push it away, and that's very hard. It's still just, you can't fully inhibit that. Another explanation is that you are insufficiently prepared. That although you know what to do task next, you only can do your final preparation when actually the stimulus comes up. There are further explanations to that, just to illustrate what the way of thinking and explanation is in these paradigm. So what you need in terms of executive control here is that you constantly need to switch to a new task set, and you need to inhibit the old task set. However, the task switching paradigm is a little bit of a funny thing, because from everyday life, a lot of people would say, yeah, switching between tasks may be demanding or something. However, when you do that in this experimental setting, you observe task switching costs only under certain circumstances. And they are when your response set and or your stimulus set is ambiguous. What does that mean? In Jersil's original study, you can do both tasks, plus and minus, addition and subtraction with all the stimuli. So the stimulus is ambiguous with what you are doing. The funny thing is, just add the operator for the participant what he has to do with every number, and your task switching costs go away. So you need this ambiguity. Same thing with the Roger and Monsell paradigm. You always present both potential stimuli in the quadrants. And you have mapped the responses to the same fingers. Do the paradigm like that, present only the stimulus, which is where you need the task to do on, like only the 7 here, and then the G here, task switching costs are gone. So that's a little bit of a funny finding, and of course you now may say, okay, what's the real application then? Because where do we have situations that we really have this ambiguity? And I remember I once spoke to a researcher who did a lot in the area of task switching. So this was his area of speciality. And he came from Israel. And he said, well, really the only everyday example he could come up with is that in Israel they have keyboards with Hebrew and Latin alphabets on there. And if you switch between these alphabets, then you have this ambiguity because you have one key which is assigned with 2 different letters, basically. But there's not really very much more examples. Not much more examples for that. So this is an example where you have a research paradigm where there are literally hundreds and hundreds of studies. When you search Google Scholar for task switching, you nearly find 20,000 results. There's a review paper by Stephen Monsell in 2003, which is cited more than 1,000 times. So this shows that task switching is extremely popular, although there's no real everyday application to that. And I don't want to look this bad. Of course, there is a very high interest in this paradigm because it still tells us a lot about the mental organization of our mind. So it can tell us a lot to inform cognitive psychology. And it's relevant for, let's say, basic science or fundamental science. However, only the application side of things may be a little bit questionable here. Okay, and of course we have working memory as a typical background for executive functions. And Badley and Hitch originally said that working memory basically is that you can maintain information while at the same time do a cognitive task. Then you need the central executive system and executive functions. Randy Engel had a slightly different definition of that, and he said it's, for once, the maintenance of information again. Slightly different memory concept behind that. However, and then what he said, controlled attention, what I said before. And this controlled attention has a limited capacity. So he would say working memory is short-term memory plus controlled attention. And controlled attention basically equals, in this context, the concept of executive control or executive functions. There are a couple of working memory span tasks which kind of test your span, and by this you might say your executive abilities. We already spoke in the second lecture on language about the reading span task, so we go through that very quickly only. You have to, in this task, you have to read sentences and remember the last word. So I went home with a taxi. The driver gave me some cash. The sky was clear and blue. These sentences may be related or unrelated. Important is you really have to read these sentences for understanding. So you really have this processing component, and you have this maintenance component by remembering the last words. And in the end, you're asked to recall only last words in the correct order, like taxi, cash, blue, and so forth. A related task or similar task, just with a different processing demand, is the so-called operation span. Here you first have to solve mathematical equations. 3 times 4 plus 2 equals 14. Correct, yes or no? You have to respond speedily to that as quickly as possible. Then you see a letter, for instance D. Then the next task comes up, equation. You have to say yes or no. Next letter comes up, and so forth. And in the end, you have to recall the letter in the correct sequence. And by varying the length here, you can see how much letters can people keep in their mind, maintain, and correctly. And this is then the working memory span. And it has been shown that this memory span highly correlates, like with general intelligence, achievement in school, things like that. Okay. Okay, to summarize that part, we have seen that we have a variety of tasks which can be used to assess executive or investigate executive control. And there are many, many more tasks, like multitasking, for instance. And one question, of course, is whether these executive functions which are required or assessed in these tasks, are they all boiling down to one unitary executive control mechanism? Or is executive control subdivided? Is inhibition a completely different function to monitoring, which may be completely different to switching? So do we have subcomponents here? And a study by Miyake has shown that there is some relationship between these subcomponents, but there are some differences as well. So it seems to be that the idea is that on the one hand we can say, yeah, it makes sense to group them into one concept of executive control functions because they are related to each other, but it makes sense to say, okay, within this category we have subdivisions of tasks. They belong to the same set, but they can be differentiated as well. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. Before we go into the break, I would again like to distribute these module evaluations, and very, very important, if you fill that up, sorry. Okay, that's stupid. You are asked to have the students to turn off their mobile phones, and then the lecturer forgets it himself. Okay, so if you filled that out last week, don't fill it out again, okay? Only the ones who have not filled it out before, please fill it out. And afterwards, I would need one volunteer to collect that and bring that over to the TPO office in the ground floor of the Heinz Wolf building. Okay, then let's have a break, and then we go to the exam preparation.